On August 19th of this year, I posted a video expressing my enthusiasm for what was then the forthcoming biopic about Bob Dylan, directed by James Mangold, called A Complete Unknown. It was promising for a variety of reasons, one of which was that James Mangold has plenty of experience doing musical biopics about music legends. He had previously done what I consider to be a rather terrific film about Johnny Cash called Walk the Line back in 2005, for which Reese Witherspoon, in her role as June Carter Cash, earned an Oscar nomination as a Best Supporting Actress. Joaquin Phoenix was nominated for Best Actor, and justifiably so. Joaquin Phoenix's portrayal of Johnny Cash was brilliant, and it's the reason that Boyd Holbrook in this film, A Complete Unknown, starring as Johnny Cash, had his work cut out for him. And as I'm about to get into, I think he rises to the occasion rather compellingly. But at that time, I posted that video after having previously posted a series of videos just lambasting what I believe to be the mediocrity plaguing the biopic space in Hollywood these days. There was a time, I'm not going to rehash all the misgivings there. There are going to be plenty of misgivings to hash out here in this video, so I'm not going to pile on the prior misgivings onto the misgivings I'm going to express in this video. Go back and find those videos. They're easy to find. There's one about the forthcoming Michael Jackson biopic, the Amy Winehouse biopic that I watched, the Bob Marley biopic that came out early this year. But as I was just saying, there was a time when Hollywood had a grasp of the biopic about the music legend. For me, Walk the Line is just such an example. Ray, with the brilliant Jamie Foxx portraying Ray Charles in 2004, the year before Walk the Line came out. There's the brilliant film called Control from 2007 about Ian Curtis of Joy Division that I think was stunning as well. But these days, Hollywood has long since lost its way with the biopic. I had hoped that this one, A Complete Unknown, was going to be an exception to that unfortunate rule. For many reasons, I wanted to love this film. At the time that I posted this video on August 19th, talking about the forthcoming release of A Complete Unknown, James Mangold had just done a brilliant interview with the legendary Brian Hiatt at Rolling Stone. It was almost an hour long. I loved it. It was illuminating. He was getting out there his whole philosophy of filmmaking, of narrative, as it pertains to the biopic and other genres within filmmaking. He was talking about personal interactions he had with Dylan, who personally annotated the script for this film, which is as worrying as it is fascinating for reasons I'll get into. There was all this Oscar buzz, right? Because the film at that time, it was known, was going to be rushed to a Christmas Day release. They just wrapped up filming, I believe, in March in Hoboken, New Jersey, I think was the setting for many of the Greenwich Village type scenes that the film portrays from the early 1960s when Dylan arrives in New York in around January 24th of 1961 at age 19, having amazingly hitchhiked there, almost penniless, to meet his legend Woody Guthrie and make it big in the music scene with which he had been obsessed since he was a boy. So, there was this buzz about James Mangold, who's done all these films, Ford v Ferrari and Indiana Jones and Girl Interrupted, when Angelina Jolie won the Oscar for Best Actress. The guy's experience, the guy's resume, the guy's canon is unbelievable. Copland, one of my favorite films of all time, with De Niro, with Ray Liotta, with Sylvester Stallone, all in the same flick. I think that was only his first real feature film. He had done Heavy previous to that, but Copland was he was still not necessarily a widely known entity in Hollywood, and yet listen to these A-list actors showing up for him as long ago as that. And Timothy Chalamet is as hot as it gets these days, showing up for Mangold to portray the lead role here in Bob Dylan in this film. So, Timothy Chalamet, of course, there was Oscar buzz surrounding his performance. He was going to win best, or at least get a Best Actor nomination. Mangold, maybe for the first time in his career, finally gets that Best Picture Oscar, for which he feels deserving as a celebrated veteran of the craft. So, again, I went into this film with high hopes, but limited expectations. I wanted to love this film, and for the first few minutes, I really did love it, albeit with at least one gripe that I think, if I recall correctly, elicited an out-loud groan or prolonged sigh from me. I'll get into that in a minute, but I felt chills watching the first few minutes of this film. Dylan arrives hitchhiking in the back of a station wagon. These anonymous people drive him up to the maw of a tunnel, as one review put it, I think, in the New Yorker. And there he is in New York to meet Woody Guthrie and make it big. And I'm thinking to myself, this kid really did this. This kid from Hibbing, Minnesota, which, by the way, doesn't have any greater a population now as it did back in the 1950s. About 16,200 people today, about 16,200 people back then. This is a relatively small town, right? That Dylan grows up in, listening to radio programs, pumping blues and folk into his ears in the middle of the night. He's crazed by it. He's getting obsessed with it. He's trying to figure out, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Lightnin' Hopkins and Leadbelly and Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger on his guitar by himself, just getting the hang of trying to hone his craft, groping at this dream that's fermenting within him. As an adolescent and as a teenager, and he books it from Minnesota, hitchhikes to New York City, wants to meet Woody Guthrie, and does. First meets Arlo Guthrie at Woody's house, then later on meets Woody at Sid and Bob Gleason's house, where they're taking Woody away from the hospital on weekends. They were granted permission from the hospital to have Woody there on weekends. He's dying of a nerve disease that also killed his mom, so it's a genetically inherited, predisposition to this terrible, debilitating disease that really afflicts Woody with increasing vigor in the last years of his life. Throughout the 1960s, he dies in 1967. But that gave me chills just thinking, the courage, the chutzpah, the audacity, the self-belief that it took for Bob Dylan to do this at age 19, an utterly unknown nobody, walking into the New York City folk scene at that time, and within a matter of a year or two, becoming this dominant presence. A few years later, he's a millionaire in the mid-1960s, having changed the world. It's just an incredible moment to think about. James Mangold feels the same way about that aspect of Dylan's story, and it's why he starts there, although I believe that it might have served the narrative better to have started a little earlier in Dylan's life, as Elijah Wald does in Dylan Goes Electric. That's the book upon which this film is based. A part of the reason I wanted to love this film was, and I've said this in previous videos, I am one of the world's biggest Bob Dylan fans. And I know when I say that, Elijah Wald, I can hear him groaning, right? James Mangold, oh, here's another one of these Dylanologists who just wants to pound his chest about all the facts that we took liberties with or got wrong or whatever. But my problems with this film have nothing to do with the liberties it takes with the facts. It does that abundantly, but that's not the point for me. I will add, by the way, that no one needs to explain to me how storytelling works, okay? I myself wrote a book for a major publisher that was optioned for film. It was based on a 2,000-word feature I wrote for the New York Times. I've edited a magazine for the past decade for which I've written many features based on countless interviews with an equally countless assortment of characters. I have a master's degree in creative writing. I understand how storytelling works. I don't need to be tutored in the distinction between documentary and biopic, okay? I understand that you have to take some liberties with facts. You have to tell a story with a biopic. You have to report the facts in a documentary. That's an important distinction. Mangold talks about that distinction in plenty of interviews. He certainly discussed it with Brian Hiatt. I totally get that. None of that is beyond me. I understand storytelling. I myself have been doing it for decades. Again, that has nothing to do with the problems that I have with this film. So please, don't box me in with these sycophantic, lunatic, Dylanologists who wring their hands over the slightest liberty that one takes with the facts that are at least known, to the extent that facts can be known about a man as mercurial and enigmatic as Dylan. That's not the point here. I'm not that Dylanologist who is of that ilk, at least, okay? So I'll get into the problems that I experienced as this film unfolded before me a couple days ago. But I first want to say this. There's a breathtaking volume of brilliant acting sprinkled throughout this film from start to finish, almost to the point that a part of me worries that the praise that Timothée Chalamet justly is receiving for his portrayal of Dylan in this film overshadows the many brilliant performances surrounding him throughout. Those performances include Monica Barbaro, who kills it as Joan Baez. kills it as Joan Baez in this film. She is remarkable. What a presence in this film. I mean, she's drop dead gorgeous, first of all, which is important because Joan Baez in her day was as physically beautiful as her voice was gorgeous, and that was a key element of what made her such a striking stage presence in her time, okay? But more than that, she has this authoritative command of her role, portraying a woman in Joan Baez who unyieldingly holds her ground against this colossal force of nature that is Bob Dylan, with whom she becomes both personally and professionally entangled over the course of the film. There are these wonderful scenes in which Barbaro, I think, steals the scene as she's sharing the screen with Chalamet. The much ballyhooed Timothy Chalamet performs with Bob, in the film at least, at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. That did not happen. They did not perform together at the 1965 Folk Festival. I can link to the Business Insider story in which they stipulate that in the description of this video. But the scene itself really provides a platform on which Barbaro's talents as Joan Baez here absolutely shine. She flips Dylan the bird at one point as she's performing when he's off to the side, bewilderingly, with the character Elle Fanning portraying Suze Rotolo. And more about that. That is the strangest moment in the film. There's inexplicable that it takes this narrative detour. I'll talk about that in a minute. But then, you know, this film also portrays the moment on Hollywood in 1964 when Joan and Bob are in real life. This happened, you know, they're on stage together, and Joan wants to do Blowin' in the Wind with Bob, who by that point in 1964 is leaning toward rock and roll, although importantly, it seems to me, not away from folk. You know, Maggie's Farm, the furious, electrified rocker with which he opens his brief but cataclysmic history-making set at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, was based on a 1929 song called Down on Penny's Farm by a group out of North Carolina called the Bentley Boys, which was on Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music, which came in this red sort of fabric-cased box that I listened to ad nauseum when I was in college. I learned about things like Clarence Ashley in particular blew my mind. Doc Boggs with Sugar Baby. This stuff electrified me when I was a teenager. And this song was on that set, which in and of itself is based on a song that dates back to the end of the Civil War called Lawson's Farm. So Dylan is using the folk tradition against the folk tradition at the Newport Folk Festival with Maggie's Farm, which has deep roots entrenched in the folk tradition itself, which is just a sort of this meta layer that you add to what Dylan did that day. The weapon he used was the weapon that was created by the very people who are populating and putting on this festival. To just blow it to bits and open the door to the future of music. I mean, it can't be overstated, and I don't think it is overstated what Dylan did that day. But Dylan refuses to do Blowin' in the Wind with Joan, and Monica Barbaro handles this scene masterfully and takes control of it. And Dylan, kind of like a sniveling little baby, walks backstage, and Joan's like, well, I guess I'll just do it by myself then. And she does Blowin' in the Wind. There's my first time hearing her do Blowin' in the Wind, I think, was on the Forrest Gump soundtrack back in, 1994, is the first time I heard Joan Baez doing Blowin' in the Wind when I was about 14 years old. And it's you don't soon forget it. I mean, her vocals she belts it out, and there's so much conviction to her gorgeous voice. Speaking of which, Barbaro is singing herself just as Timothy Chalamet does. And by the way, Mangold says in his interview with Brian Hiatt that all the singing and performing is done live on set. There's no lip syncing. There's no overdubbing. That's really impressive. And that's another aspect of the talent that Monica and Timothy both bring to their respective roles here. But Elle Fanning as Suze Rotolo. She's Sylvie Russo in the film at the behest of Dylan himself, reportedly. Dylan did not want Susie Rotolo's name to be used in the film. Mangold complied with that request, which is an indication of the influence that Bob himself personally, at age 83, wielded over this script, which is as troubling as it is fascinating, for reasons we'll get into in a little bit. But Elle Fanning as Suze Rotolo, getting the way she masterfully captures, at times without even saying anything, but with her facial expressions and the intense, powerful way that she sort of uses her body and her face to communicate emotions in response to the circumstance of this ordinary girl who's getting caught up in the monstrous whirlwind of Bob Dylan's expanding fame and then retreats from it, probably a wise move on her part. The way she carries that out, again, I believe it was my experience with this film, as celebrated as Chalamet is for his role as Dylan. I think she steals these scenes that she shares the stage with Chalamet. I mean, even down to when Dylan shows up at her, I mean, this is probably a made-up scene, but he gets punched in the face in one scene after attending his buddy Bob Newhirth's electric gig at a pub in New York City, ends up at Suze Rotolo's house to get his face bruise patched up a little bit and leaves. And even then, in the quiet of that late-night scene, she has just she's got a composure and a command in her performance that I found to be really impressive. Elle Fanning, what a talent. By the way, it's a fascinating interchange between Suze Rotolo and Dylan that culminates with one of the most terrible songs in Bob Dylan's canon. A song on another side of Bob Dylan called Ballad in Plain D came out in 1964, in which he excoriates Suze, her mother Mary, her sister Carla. He calls her sister in the lyrics of the song a, quote, parasite. And in 1985, Dylan was asked, do you wince, Bobby, when you look back on that particular tune? And he said, oh yeah, that one. I look back and say, I must have been a real schmuck to write that. I look back at that particular one and say, of all the things I've written, maybe I could have left that alone. So, terrible as that 8-minute plus, by the way, diatribe is, listen to it if you're at all interested in what went wrong with Suze Rotolo and Dylan. Dylan lays out the story, at least from his rather vindictive and self-pitying perspective in that song. So you can check that out. Now, here's where I get to one of the big problems I had with Mangold's handling of this narrative. At one point, as the narrative is charging ahead to the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, all of a sudden there's this completely fabricated scene in which it feels like the film abruptly hits the rewind button and drags us back to Suze Rotolo. Why, it is utterly beyond me. And Dylan shows up at her apartment in 1965, at a time at which he has long been done with Suze Rotolo. He's been with and beyond Joan Baez and is connecting with the woman who will become his wife, Sarah Lones, who is completely ignored in the film. And I have a speculation as to why that occurs as well. And we'll get to that in a minute too. But he shows up on his motorcycle to take Suze to the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. It feels jarring. It feels disruptive. It feels unnecessary, not just because it's totally untrue, but it serves no useful purpose that I can discern to the narrative itself. What is the point of this awkward rewinding back to Suze Rotolo at this time? I mean, he's at that point months away from marrying Sarah Lones. Cryptically, I would add, on the second anniversary of the JFK assassination, November 22nd, 1965. Make of that what you will. But nonetheless, Suze Rotolo's role is carried out with mastery, just as Monica Barbaro's role as Joan Baez is. One thinks about the amount of minutes that are consumed by this strange detour the narrative takes as it forces Bob's character to motorcycle off to Suze Rotolo's apartment at a time when in real life he had long since been done with her. What else could have been done with that time in this 2-hour and 21-minute film? I would suggest that what could have been done with, what is that, 5, 6, 7 minutes, I don't know, that it spends on this weird detour, on the earlier portions of Dylan's life before he gets to New York City. I'll have a couple suggestions as to what could have been done there that might have been more illuminating, that might have packaged the narrative in at least with more clarity than perhaps is available when Dylan just out of nowhere, out of context, just is dumped on a street corner in New York City in the very first scene. It feels like a missed opportunity, compounded by the fact that the film, in my view, wastes time on this fabrication between Bob and Suze. But enough of that. Boyd Holbrook, this is fascinating. He nails it as Johnny Cash. Brilliant, in my view, okay? And I think the argument can be made that Boyd Holbrook, of all the actors in this film, including Chalamet, had the most pressure hoisted upon him. Because, as I said earlier, Holbrook is portraying Johnny Cash 20 years after Joaquin Phoenix, one of the most brilliant living actors of our time, portrayed Johnny Cash with an intensity all his own, and in doing so earned himself a Best Actor nomination. And Boyd Holbrook, against the backdrop of all of that pressure, all of that precedent, is tasked with doing that again. Now you give us your take on Johnny Cash, big guy. And he knocks it out of the park. It's possibly, you could say, is the most impressive acting performance in the entire film. I mean, he absolutely meets this challenge, capturing Johnny in his days high on pills, working his ass off to expand his fan base through unlikely gigs, by the way, at the 1964 Newport Folk Festival. He was not there in 65 as the film portrays. There's this wonderful scene between Holbrook's Johnny Cash and Chalamet's Dylan in the parking lot of a hotel, a snippet of which actually can just be readily accessed on YouTube. You look at there's a moment when Holbrook looks Dylan in the eyes, real up close, gets in his face, and he nails Johnny in that moment. Again, with an expressionless moment in which he says nothing but just looks at Dylan with the eyes of Johnny Cash. And the brilliance of his talent shines in that wordless gesture. This is the extent to which the acting, often enough in this film, is brilliant. And that cannot often be said of the many biopics that I have impugned over the course of the series of videos I've done about biopics on this channel, okay? And that is absolutely a way in which this one's a cut above the rest. And lastly, Ed Norton. We must not forget about Ed Norton, who is another one of the people that I would classify as one of our greatest living actors. I've been watching Ed steal scenes since I was a kid. He's been at it for a long time. I remember he did this role alongside, De Niro and Marlon Brando. I'm forgetting the title of which, but he plays like the role of this master thief. Ed Norton has done so much great work. And in this film as Pete Seeger, I really appreciate the sort of the humanity that Ed Norton brings to Pete Seeger's character throughout the film. Although I would suggest, having read Elijah Wald's book as I have, I think he falls short of capturing just how unglued Pete Seeger becomes in the moment at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival when Bob is cracking the music world in half with this incendiary set as Mike Bloomfield is blasting his guitar like a machine gun behind him, slaying the audience alongside Dylan, and it just luxuriating in the opportunity to do so. Pete Seeger is described by Elijah Wald as a man who didn't lose it often, but when he did, boy did he lose it, and he lost it that day. And his wife Toshi had to calm him down. The director James Mangold toys around with the whole axe scene. There's this apocryphal story of Pete Seeger taking an axe to the wires of the amplifiers to cut the music off, or at least gesturing toward doing so. It never happened. There's someone in the crowd in real life, or not someone in the crowd, Peter Yarrow, I think, mentions on stage from Peter, Paul, and Mary that Dylan is getting his axe, or someone's getting their axe, or whatever, which is slang for guitar. That becomes intertwined with this whole, apocryphal tale of Pete Seeger taking an axe to the amps because he was so pissed off and horrified about Dylan's performance. That's nonsense. The Seeger changed his tune in years later when he called Maggie's Farm a great song, and said his only misgiving wasn't with the substance of the performance, but rather with the sound quality. A jury's out on that one, Pete. Sorry, buddy. Pete is overheard, according to Wald's narrative, telling his dad over like a meal, like the next day, I think, or breakfast the next morning, that he thought Dylan had so much promise. And he did, Pete, as we know now. In these scenes in which Chalamet is sharing the screen with his fellow actors, Monica Barbaro, Elle Fanning, Boyd Holbrook, Ed Norton, I feel as though he is graciously leaving them all the space they need to totally own their characters. And in doing so, I really feel like they steal it. They steal these scenes again and again alongside the justly celebrated Chalamet, who brings a kind of subdued energy to his performance as Dylan, which I think reflects Mangold's resignation before the task of trying to undo the puzzle of Dylan's life and personality. Mangold doesn't bother at all. He talks about this in interviews. He talks about it with Brian Hiatt, how he really is sensitive to the idea of boiling Dylan down to some simple psychological insight that explains everything about him. But he went in completely the opposite direction and doesn't bother at all. Whereas Elijah Walden, the book upon which the film is based, reveals plenty about the fullness of Dylan's character in ways that I do think the film could have spent a little more time on, at the expense, I would say, of this weird Suze Rotolo detour where she's dragged off to a folk festival she never attended in real life. And if that's me being a Dylanologist, who doesn't like to see the facts of Dylan's life as they are known, taken liberty with, okay, fine. But I think it's about more than that here. I just think take all the liberty you want, but maybe do so with a little more restraint, than was practiced in this film. In other ways that I'll get into. Now, I mentioned, as an aside, this moment with Suze Rotolo in 1965, at a time when in real life Dylan was well on his way toward marriage with not Joan Baez, certainly not Suze Rotolo, but Sarah Lones. It's fascinating that the film completely ignores her, especially when one knows, again, that Dylan specifically requested that Suze Rotolo's name be changed in the film, and Mangold complied. Well, Sarah Lones, when she divorced Bob Dylan in 1977, was reportedly paid $36 million, in part, perhaps in large part, to remain silent forever about her life with Dylan. And to my knowledge, she has done so. I don't think there's been hardly a word publicly out of Sarah Dillon, during the time she was married to him, since their divorce. And by the way, $36 million in 2024 money is $187.5 million. Dylan paid this woman a hell of a lot of money to stay silent, to shut up about her life with Dylan. Just an astonishing amount of money for the day. So it stands to reason, perhaps, that neither she nor Bob had any interest in Sarah being presented in any way at any point in this film. And indeed, she is entirely ignored. That I understand. I don't necessarily, Mangold says that one of the pitfalls of films is too much story, as he put it in one of the interviews of his that I listened to. And in this instance, maybe he felt the insertion of Sarah Dillon would have been too much story. I would suggest that the Suze Rotolo thing is too much story, buddy. And what was that? It didn't need that. There's actual story based on known facts that would have been more compelling than that I think would have been quite revealing in an illuminating, clarifying, and compelling way. But Baez and Dylan both had influence over this script, which perhaps was also part of the problems that, in my view, emerged from the complete project. Again, I've said this in prior videos about biopics. These artists, if their permission is going to be earned to use their music in a film, that requires their approval. And as we've seen with the Prince documentary, I'm not going to go on and on about that again, but I mean, the Prince estate has shelved Netflix's 9-hour-long Prince documentary produced by Ezra Edelman because they object to the substance of the film. There are certain things about Prince they don't want the world to know, and so they're refusing to grant permission for his music to be used. Well, how the hell are you going to have a 9-hour documentary about Prince without music by Prince? You're not going to do that, right? Well, Mangold needed Joan Baez's buy-in. He needed Dylan's buy-in. For their music to be used. And so, he says in his interview, I think, with Hiatt, that Baez was sent portions of the script for her approval to earn her permission to use her music. Bob Dylan personally annotated the script, had input, concocted a fictionalized scene for the film. What scene that is, no one knows. There's speculation on that, but no reporting on it. Maybe that'll come out at some point. it disappointed me that Brian Hiatt, one of our most experienced and celebrated music journalists, never asked, at least in the recording, the 53-minute long recording of his interview with Mangold, whether he was at all concerned about there being some kind of conflict of interest or Dylan having too much influence on a film about himself. That never comes up in his conversation with Mangold. Perhaps it has in other interviews with Mangold I haven't heard. I would love to hear Mangold's thoughts on that. It's a big problem for biopics. How do you tell truthfully, which means in some instances tell things that the artist may not be comfortable with the public knowing about in a documentary, while also at the same time securing permission from the artist to use their music? It's a really fine line to walk. How did Mangold walk it? It seems like he capitulated to Dylan to the extent that he could, maybe more than he should have. Maybe he could have, I don't know, had a little more leverage and flexed a little more muscle with Bob than evidently he did. Another point that I would make about Dylan's influence over the script, it calls to mind something that Bruce Springsteen said to NPR's Terry Gross in a 2016 interview with her when he was talking about his early days, just getting started, when he's just getting started out and he wants to find a way to stand out. And he believes that his looks weren't going to carry him to the heights of fame. He believes his guitar playing, while excellent, was not going to carry him to the heights of fame either. That he wasn't going to stand out because he was no Eddie Van Halen. He wasn't one of the greatest guitar players on the planet, albeit he was a very good one. So what did he decide upon as the way to stand out? Well, become a great writer, which he, of course, has done. Well, two things on that with respect to Dylan. One is this film reveals absolutely nothing about how Bob Dylan honed his craft as a lyricist to the extent that he wins the Nobel Prize in Literature, the only songwriter ever to do so. We learn nothing about how this happened. And here again is where some more substantive time could have been spent on the character of Suze Rotolo, who in real life was responsible for introducing Bob to great books. And Dave Van Ronk is almost completely ignored in this film. It's his couch that he sleeps on, not Pete Seeger's, when Dylan gets to the village. And it's Dave Van Ronk who introduces Bob to all sorts of literature and philosophy, and is a big player in the cultivation of Bob Dylan's intellect, and thereby his craft as a songwriter that emerges from that expansion of his knowledge of literature and experience and engagement with it. So would that have been too much story, Jim? I guess. I mean, again, that's time better spent than the Suze Rotolo detour in 1965, in my view. Now, Elijah Wald takes people like me to task when we express these criticisms with the following quote that I found of his in a story on the film. He says, "The silliest possible reactions I've seen are people saying, I come out of the film and I don't feel like I knew Dylan any better than I did going in." And here's Wald saying, I feel like if I had come out of the film thinking I knew Dylan better, that he was a more knowable character, I would have felt like it was fake. I don't know anybody who knew him in that time who didn't feel like he was always kind of cagey. Okay, but can we at least just know what we know and let the audience make about what it will? Some of the things we know are more compelling than some of the things that were concocted for this film. This is why so many biopics feel like affronts to the intelligence of the viewing public. We know things about Dylan from the time he was a kid that reveal his humanity, the color in his character, the fun in him, the joy, the levity, the full person. Where is that in this film? There are two of these gratuitous moments in the film that feel maudlin and condescending, and two moments that are absent in the film, one from Wald's book and another from an interview that Mangold did, I think from his Brian Hiatt interview. Their void in the film feels like it does a painful disservice to the narrative. What are those gratuitous moments? Well, very early on in the film, and this is where, admittedly, I got chills again thinking about, wow, look what this kid did. The courage, the self-belief, both of which Dylan clearly possesses in great abundance, that it took for him to do this. But he goes to New York City and he meets Woody Guthrie. And of course, right away, they send him to the hospital. He learns at a bar from, I believe, a character portraying Dave Van Ronk, that he's at the Greystone Park Hospital in Morris Plains, New Jersey at that time. And he goes right to the hospital. And of course, Pete Seeger is right there at Woody's bedside, because why not? And of course, the fully formed version of Song to Woody by Bob Dylan, which had not even been written yet, is readily on the tip of Dylan's tongue, and he sits there and performs that song for Woody. In truth, Bob Dylan goes looking for Woody at his house and confronts a 13-year-old Arlo Guthrie at the time in 1961, who opens the door and lets him in. He has said, Arlo has in some interviews, that it was because he liked Dylan's shoes. It's been said that it was because Dylan had his guitar with him. I've read stories about him jamming with Arlo in Woody Guthrie's living room at the time, but Guthrie was not there. He was at the hospital. However, it was not at the hospital where Dylan first meets Guthrie. It was, again, at Sid and Bob Gleason's house. They are hosting him on weekends on Sunday, January 29th, 1961. That seems the likely date on which Dylan finally meets Woody Guthrie for the first time and plays Woody his own songs, Woody's own songs, while also rummaging Sid and Bob Gleason's rather abundant and eclectic record collection. How is that not an interesting scene? How is it not doubly illuminating for Dylan to be rummaging through the record collection of these caretakers of Woody on weekends, at least, while playing Woody Guthrie's own music for him, having shown... How is that not more illuminating of the tenderness and devotion to which Bob Dylan has committed himself to the canon of Woody Guthrie, than showing him having learned Guthrie's songs, having invested the labor required in doing so, and then playing them right for the man himself? That, to me, would have been a beautiful scene. But no, we went with this package, maudlin, to me, kind of condescending, let's just have him sing Song to Woody Guthrie upon first meeting the man. And I've seen some reviews in which they specifically complain about the naivety and indulgence underlying this flourish in the narrative, where they say, oh, of course he plays Song to Woody for Woody Guthrie, which doesn't appear until Dylan's debut record in 1962, the following year. He wrote after meeting Woody, having been inspired by his meeting with Woody. So this kind of an indulgent flourish in Mangold and Jay Cox's script is like something out of a 1980s era Spielberg film, rather than a 2024 feature film that is going to hold its own against the cynicism and jadedness of a 2024 audience. I'm sorry, but anyone with even a scrap of knowledge that someone like me has about when Dylan wrote a certain song or the circumstances in which he met Woody is going to blanch at that. And you're seeing it come out in the criticism. And even it could be argued, I think, that you might not even need to know anything about the circumstance in which Dylan met Woody first in New York or wrote Song to Woody to think, this seems kind of predictable. When you're watching that, it's maudlin. Sorry, but that's how it comes off to me. Then there's this Judas moment, which Mangold and Jay Cox, his co-screenwriter for the script, Jay Cox having previously written the screenplay for Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese, they inject this Judas moment into the 1965 Music Festival. So here's the deal. There's a concert on May 17th, 1966 at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, England, that is documented on the 1998 release Bootleg Series Volume 4, where Bob Dylan does the first half acoustic set. Gorgeous, deeply captivating acoustic set, where he's doing Visions of Johanna, my favorite Bob Dylan song. He's doing Tambourine Man. He's doing songs like that. But then he comes out and does a searing, incendiary, iconoclastic, electric set that just lights these audiences on fire, at least half of which are furiously booing him from start to finish, trying to boo him off stage. And Dylan is having none of it, and he's taking it to him, and it's all on tape, man. You got to hear it. And as he's getting out of Ballad of a Thin Man and going into Like a Rolling Stone, this fool Keith Butler fan in the audience shouts, "Judas!" And Dylan fascinatingly responds by saying, "I don't believe you. You're a liar." And then turns back to his band, Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm, giants of rock and roll, and says, "Play effing loud." Well, this happened not on a different continent from the Newport Folk Festival, nearly a year later. And my problem with the use of that scene, the injection of that scene in a totally different context, is not that it departs from the biological or chronological facts of Dylan's life, but that it was unnecessary. It's maudlin, it's unrestrained, it's not disciplined in my view. Because what we know about the audience reaction to his set at the 1965 Folk Festival is at least as if not even more compelling. We know that people are shouting at Bob to play Beatles songs. We know this from Elijah Wold's book. We know from journalist Robert Shelton that people were in fact booing in the audience. It's hard to hear them because of the audio set up on stage, as Wold explains, but that was happening according to Robert Shelton, a talented veteran, highly regarded journalist who was there in the crowd, documents that. We know that people were asking for Pete Seeger to come back on stage and get Dylan the hell out of there. We know that there are people who were calling for Bob to grab his wooden box and acoustic guitar and just do the Bob thing, blowing in the wind and chimes of freedom and times they are changing. That Bob, can you just be him again? Can we just have Masters of War one more time, please? That's what we know. So to me, the decision to inject the Judas moment into a moment in which it did not occur is manifestly a symptom of Hollywood's distrust of its audience when it pertains to biopics. There's enough information in what we know about the audience's response to Dylan's electric set at the 1965 Folk Festival that is compelling enough to make clear to the audience that there were plenty of people there who were not happy with what Dylan was doing. There were plenty of people there who went there specifically to hear the rock and roll that Dylan was just coming out with at that time, and were Beatle maniacs and wanted to hear more of that rock sound as Dylan was crafting it with albums like Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited. But no, we had to overzealously overreach and show them calling him Judas too, and see. That's how uncomfortable and unhappy the crowd was. The truth is much more complicated and therefore, to me, more fascinating and more compelling and more illustrative of the stakes that were at play in this moment when Dylan made one of the most courageous artistic decisions in the history of American pop music. That moment, that day, that toasty July day in Newport at the 1965 Folk Festival. So it's just another one of those moments when I think that Mangold and Jaycox just they build the narrative a bridge too far, especially for contemporary audiences, which again bring a cynicism and a jadedness to the theater these days that didn't exist decades ago. Wold, as I mentioned, he documents the audience's real reaction to this, and I would argue, when Wold is saying, well, it would have been fake had crowds been leaving the theater or feeling like they knew more about Dylan than they did going in. That's fake. This is fake, dude. I mean, the whole Judas thing, injecting that into the scene which didn't exist, it's unnecessary. It's literally fake. And I bring as little understanding to that creative decision by Mangold and Cox as I do to the Suze Rotolo detour in the narrative with respect to the 1965 events. But there's also some wonderful stuff that is not included in the film. You have these gratuitous moments with the Judas moment and the Woody Guthrie thing. But in Elijah Wold's book, there's this beautiful, charming, wonderfully illuminating scene early in Dylan's life when he's about 15 years old at high school in Hibbing, Minnesota. And some girl he's then just dating starts talking about her love of music. And Dylan just goes bonkers with this camaraderie that he's discovering with someone else who might bring a scrap of the fervor that he has burning within him specifically for rock and roll, not just for folk music, not just for Woody Guthrie, not even just for Hank Williams, but for Little Richard, for Buddy Holly and the Crickets, for those types, for the blues guys, Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry and Howlin' Wolf and Lightnin' Hopkins, right? This scene is completely absent from the film. Again, we know nothing about the Dylan that is dumped on a sidewalk in New York City in 1961 at the start of this film. Listen to this quote from Elijah Wold's book. Back in Hibbing, musical knowledge also won Bob his first serious girlfriend, which is adorable. Echo Hellstrom was a working-class teenager from the wrong side of the tracks and recalled, "He was always so well-dressed and quiet, I had him pegged for a goody-goody." But one day, she was at a local cafe with a girlfriend and saw him standing outside playing his guitar on the street. And when he came in, he explained that he was forming a band. Hellstrom had been tuning in to late-night R&B broadcasts from Shreveport and asked if he knew the song Maybelline. In her recollection, Bob exploded. "Maybelline by Chuck Berry? You bet I've heard it." And on about Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Little Richard, Jimmy Reed. Bob thought he was fabulous, the best, and everybody who was popular those days in other parts of the country, but who might as well have not existed as far as most of Hibbing, Minnesota was concerned. He kept going on about their music and how great it was, how he loved to play it himself, how something he wanted more than anything else to be a rock and roll singer, all with his eyes sort of rolled up in his head in a whole different world, until he stopped what he was saying, leaned halfway across the table, his eyes great, big, and whispered, You don't mean that you listen to Gatemouth Page?" a blues and country artist of the day. That's totally absent from this film. Wouldn't that be a wonderful way of establishing early on that Dylan loved rock and roll at least as much as any other genre when he got to New York and was and infiltrated the folk scene there and indoctrinated basically as a protest folk darling? But this kid was a rock and roller at heart from early days, man, and the film completely ignores that. I feel like establishing that early on in the film might have helped to really sharpen this narrative as to why he went there later on in 1965 and why it was so incendiary. Mangold's he tells a great story in an interview about how much Dylan loved not just Buddy Holly, but the Crickets, Buddy Holly's band, and watching the camaraderie the Crickets enjoy between one another as they're playing. Where is that formative experience? How long would that have taken? 30 seconds to just show Dylan at a Buddy Holly and the Crickets concert, or watching him on TV, however he encountered the music of Buddy Holly back then, as a way of further tipping off the audience to the fact that this was a rock and roller at heart, and what he loved was the idea of playing in rock and roll bands and the camaraderie among musicians as something that he loved, not necessarily just being a lonely solo acoustic performer casting off bitter ballads about the plights of sharecroppers in the Dust Bowl days of Bound for Glory. I mean, right? You know, there was so much more to that than we get in this story. Another thing that I think gets lost in this story, and I don't know how you would have included it, maybe you don't, but the opportunist in Dylan gets lost in this narrative about what he did at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. No one cultivates the notoriety that Bob Dylan enjoys to this day without being a brilliant self-promoter. Bob Dylan, like peers such as Mick Jagger or Lennon and McCartney or Brian Wilson, was a brilliant self-promoter, a brilliant opportunist. Dylan very quickly sized up the folk scene of the early 1960s in New York City, and just as quickly sized up the appetites and biases of the kind of crowds who were showing up for these Newport folk festivals that he attended in 63 and 64. They were expecting traditional folk music, erudite lectures and workshops about the history of folk music and blues, left-leaning politics and the more protest-driven material they would hear there. They expected all of that to be acoustic, with maybe some exceptions that were made over the years for the likes of Lightnin' Hopkins or Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf. In 1965, by the way, Dylan was not the first electric performance in that festival. The Chambers Brothers, famed for Time Has Come, they're that rocker that's been used in commercials. You're very familiar with it. If you cue it up on Spotify, I'm sure you'll recognize the tune. Lightnin' Hopkins played this electrified set that you can freely hear on the Live at Newport Lightnin' Hopkins album. So there were, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band plays a sizzling electric blues, Chicago blues set before Dylan takes the stage. But Dylan was the scandal, and I get it, because of his deep association with the folk tradition as a folk protest folk singer who was seen as having turned his back, Judas, on that crowd. I get it, but that's another detail that sort of gets lost in this whole narrative of Dylan going electric, as the title of Elijah Wald's book goes. But it brings me back to something that Springsteen, was talking about when he was talking about how to stand out. Well, Dylan's way of standing out was to not just cater to every whim and urgency and craving of this audience, but in fact to confront those desires of the audience, to polarize that audience, to piss them off. He turned himself into a star by turning himself into a scandal with performances like the 1965 Newport Folk Festival. That's how he chose to distinguish himself, and this, I feel, gets lost in this narrative, confronting audiences who wanted to keep him, packaged in this little box of their folk-leaning preferences with this explosive rock and roll that he knew was the future of music at the time. I don't necessarily buy this idea that Dylan was somehow confused by the response to that. I think the response to that is precisely what he was aiming for. When he's confronting audiences on tour in 1966 and Keith Butler screams Judas at him, you can find that moment on YouTube, on tape. Watch Dylan's facial expression. I will link to it in the description. Is he grinning? Is he stifling a grin, or is he genuinely angry? I see him stifling a grin in that moment. I see Dylan who knows the crowd is eating out of the palm of his hand without knowing it. He's hearing precisely what he hopes to hear. He's carving out his own path. He's becoming a more distinctive presence on the music scene based on having riled up the emotions and the prejudices and the biases within this audience at places like Free Trade Hall in Manchester, England in May of 1966. I think Bob Dylan knew exactly what he was doing. I do not buy the idea that he was at all puzzled by the reaction that his Newport Folk Festival performance in 1965 engendered. I mean, to this day, he's still using it to promote himself as some kind of wildly unpredictable, renegade, independent on the scene. On as recently as December 4th, 83-year-old Bob Dylan tweeted about this movie and said that it's about what he called the fiasco at Newport. As recently as December 4th, he's still talking about it that way, as a fiasco. No, I think it was a rather a carefully coordinated attack, Bob, and I think you knew exactly what you're doing. But no, it was this, oh man, this fiasco that my behavior must have caused. Sorry about that, right? I don't know what that was about. Well, you probably do. So listen, I think the bottom line is that A Complete Unknown documents the struggle inherent in trying to tell truthfully and independently the story about a music legend who is still alive and active as Dylan is, least of all, a music legend who has direct influence over the script on a movie about him, about his life, which appears to have been the case here. As I've said previously, it's got 43% critical rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but I thought it was a fine film. Kevin Spacey's portrayal of Bobby Darin in 2004's Beyond the Sea. That's 30 years after Bobby Darin died, and I think that's about right. I think we need to be more patient with these music legends. We need to allow time to show us how the legacies of these artists stack up against those of peers or others who came before or after them. It takes time. We've got to be patient. We need the immediate wake of the impact of these geniuses to die down a bit before we can really have a compelling, truthful, gritty narrative about what really made these geniuses tick. I hope to God that someday we actually get that about Prince or his fellow Minnesota legend, Bob Dylan. I don't for a minute believe that A Complete Unknown is going to be the final word about Bob Dylan's life on the silver screen. Maybe that comes 30 years from now. Maybe in 2062, pegged to the 100th anniversary of the release of his debut record, we get a more definitive biopic about a man who quite literally changed the world. That is, in my view, not this film for the reasons I've described here. However, go see it. There's plenty to enjoy. As I said, there are a lot of brilliant performances, not just by Chalamet, but by those surrounding him on this immensely talented cast. For that reason alone, it's worth the price of admission. Check it out, see what you think. If you've already seen it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments as to what you think. If you're about to, have at it. Also, let me know what you think after the fact. I'd love to hear from you in that regard as well. But A Complete Unknown, it's as a piece of storytelling about Bob Dylan's life. I guess I'm some kind of Dylanologist or whatever. Maybe take my misgivings with a grain of salt. Then that's fine. But those are my honest thoughts on it as someone who loves the life and work of this enigmatic, charismatic, inimitable man, Bob Dylan.